As kids across America, including mine, head back to school this week, Russia is launching waves of attacks against civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, including this recent strike on an orphanage and a children's rehabilitation center. I spoke about these attacks with Mike Breen, a former Army intel officer who has researched Russian war crimes in Ukraine as the head of an international human rights organization. Full disclosure, Mike and I recorded this conversation a few weeks ago after a Russian attack that hit a children's hospital. That's what you're looking at here. We never ended up airing that interview for a variety of reasons, but it is a testament to Russia's brutality that a conversation about targeting civilians, kids, is never not relevant, because this has become the Russian way of war. I'm sharing this interview now because I'm going to need your help soon. I'm headed back to Ukraine in a couple weeks, where I'll be reporting from Kyiv before heading to the front. Given the recent attacks by Russia against journalists covering the war, we're being careful about sharing details in advance, but I will be doing the best I can to tell the truth about what is happening in Ukraine and why it matters here. And I'll have several requests of this audience for ways to support Ukraine. More to come on that soon. Here's me and Mike Breen. So, Mike, horrific news out of Ukraine. You and I both spent time there. It's hard not to grow numb to the devastation being inflicted upon the Ukrainian people by Vladimir Putin. But I'm wondering if the timing of this is just a coincidence. And it wasn't just this children's hospital in Kyiv. There were a number of civilian targets across the country that were struck literally on the eve of NATO's major summit in the US.
Yeah, Ken, it's absolutely heartbreaking, and you and I have both spent time there, and I think I can speak for both of us. I know you and I have talked about this. The courage, resilience, use any word you want, of the Ukrainian people in the face of an attempt to wipe their way of life and their nation and their community and their bodies and their families from the face of the earth is unbelievably. It's difficult to describe, and yet they're faced with atrocity after atrocity after atrocity. And as we've seen in Syria, as we've seen in other places around the world, as we've seen in Ukraine, and this is the Russian way of war. It's war by the destruction of society, at a moral level and at a physical level. A good friend of mine who has experience in many conflict zones, Iraq, Afghanistan, was on the ground in Syria, has been on the ground in a lot of places. I asked him for his impression of what he had seen in Ukraine. And he's been all over the country since the beginning of the Russian invasion. And he had to turn to the Bible to try to describe what he had seen. And he quoted the book of Matthew, and he said, "There shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." And as you go to these villages, you and I have both seen, this is what you see. This is the latest in a series of attacks. So I have two answers to the question, why now? On the one hand, this is what the Russians have been doing at some level every day since the conflict began. And on the other hand, I think this massive attack on Kyiv and other major cities in Ukraine, using a whole host of weapons, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, air-launched cruise missiles like the one that hit the hospital, I think it's an attempt by Russia to convey really two messages. The first is, we can do this forever. We will wage this war of destruction forever, and NATO, there's nothing you can do about it. That's not true, but that's what the Russians want NATO to believe. And the second, I think, terrorist attacks and atrocities in war have a logic to them strategically. One of the things they want to do is try to provoke a very predictable set of responses from the people that the horrors inflicted upon. What this attack may do is set up a very uncomfortable series of conversations between Ukraine and partners like the United States about the pressure to retaliate, the pressure to strike deeper into Russia, to strike the bases that these bombers are being launched from, and the fear among many in NATO, including in the United States, of escalation. in a war in which one party has enough nuclear weapons to destroy biology. They're trying to set that up. They're trying to set up this feeling of helplessness and tension within the alliance, and to emotionally ensure that that conversation happens in an emotional environment of absolute anguish. They want us to feel impotent, they want us to feel broken, and they want us to feel like there's no way out of this thing. None of that's true. And of course, the Russian way of war is to do that by using the sophisticated precision weapons of the 21st century to kill children in a hospital ward.
Yeah. You described it as a terror attack, and I'm so glad you did, because it's not just the devastation that these attacks inflict upon Ukrainian civilians. It's the thought that goes into them, and I'm thinking in particular of the double tap strategy, which is striking a civilian targets, waiting until emergency responders arrive to try to pull people out of the rubble, and hitting it again when you know the ambulance crews and the fire crews are there trying to help. That is not a military strategy. That's a terror strategy.
That's absolutely right. That is terror bombing by definition. We've seen the Russian Air Force engage in this very deliberately in Syria. We're seeing them engage in the same thing in Ukraine. When citizen groups in Syria stepped up, like the White Helmets, to try to do something about Russian terror bombing of civilian targets in Syria, we saw Russian targeteers try to kill the White Helmets. And they did that in several ways, Ken. They did it with a double tap strategy, so attacking civilian targets, hoping to bring first responders out, and then trying to kill them. And there are recordings of Russian pilots speaking Russian in the cockpits of Russian aircraft talking about this. I mean, there's nothing ambiguous about any of it. They also did it through asymmetric means, trying to discredit the White Helmets, trying to go after the people who had started that organization, trying to discredit them, going after their families, trying to isolate them, throwing massive resources at the disinformation campaigns against them. And of course, we see the same thing happening in Ukraine as well. So it's in the information sphere, and with bombs, this is personal destruction. It's warfare by terror and personal destruction.
It's Ken Harbaugh. Quick break here because I have two favors to ask. We're off to a great start with the Ken Harbaugh Show on YouTube, but the podcast needs a little love. Please click the link below to follow, rate, and review. The success of shows like this really does depend on those ratings. And if you haven't yet followed me on Patreon, please check it out. It's free to sign up, or you can pitch in a few bucks a month. Every dollar goes back into this show and our pro-democracy efforts, including the reporting from Ukraine. Go to patreon.com/Ken Harbaugh. Thanks for the support. Another feature of the Russian way of war that we're only beginning to appreciate is the use of children as targets and as leverage. I know your former organization, Human Rights First, did some work around the abduction of children by the Russians, taking them from Ukraine into Russia. For those unfamiliar with that, which is, shocking in and of itself that this isn't a scandal that the whole world is talking about, can you remind us what the Russians did in the abduction of Ukrainian children in the early phase of the full-scale invasion?
Absolutely. And this continued until fairly recently. Both by the Russian government and by some of their mercenaries like Wagner Group. They have, in the name of human rights, in the name of protecting non-combatants in many cases, moved, by all estimates, tens of thousands, maybe bigger numbers, of Ukrainian children out of Ukraine and into Russia. And all indications are that those children have been concentrated at various points at places like summer camps. They've been forced to attend concerts. One of them was called Children Will Smile. And you can see footage of thousands of Ukrainian kids stone-faced while Russian comedians try to cheer them up. There appear to have been concerted attempts to indoctrinate these kids to believe that they're not Ukrainian, they're really Russian. Some of these children have been adopted by Russian families and moved as far away as Vladivostok on the Pacific coast. So there is a concerted effort to do this. It's celebrated in many ways within Russian society, in Russia, as a great humanitarian act. They've been rescued from these horrible Ukrainian supposed Nazis and delivered into their true motherland, into Russia. There are real echoes of indoctrination campaigns and mass displacement of different groups within the Soviet Union in the 30s and the 50s. This reminds me of Stalin taking tens of thousands of Chechens, most of the population of Chechnya, and kind of overnight moving them into Kazakhstan in an attempt to just erase the idea of Chechnya from the world, right? This is old Soviet stuff. It's very dark. And it's not just children. By any account, it's about 100,000, several hundred thousand maybe, Ukrainian civilians of all ages who've been moved into Russia. Some of the most politically important, some of the most, they're human rights leaders who joined the Ukrainian military and were then captured as prisoners of war and have been tried as war criminals on baseless charges in an attempt to make sure that they go to jail for the rest of their lives. So this is part of a systemic destruction of Ukrainian society, but they are very deliberately targeting the future of Ukraine, targeting children. What do you even say about it, right?
Do the latest attacks seem like a desperate move in any way? Is there, it's hard to even ask about silver linings, but from a strategic perspective, it doesn't seem like you go all out in this kind of attack unless you feel like your back's against the wall. Is there something going on within the Russian political system or the Russian military system that should give us some glimmer of a light at the end of the tunnel? I mean, the latest casualty estimates I've read are far higher than even the estimates that some of the Ukrainian general staff were suggesting, approaching the point where they might not be sustainable even for a dictator like Vladimir Putin. Is this a sign of desperation? Can you give us any glimmer of hope here?
I think there's hope in a few places. Right now, the dynamic of the war, the nature of the war that Russia is fighting, unfortunately, does favor Putin in a sense. He's turned the war, perpetual war, into his own comfort zone politically within his own country. I think we've seen that. Unfortunately, we're seeing Russian elites becoming more comfortable with endless war in Ukraine, not less. I think it's fair to say, as dark as it is, that Russian casualties, while they're difficult for Putin to sustain, have also served him in some ways, as he's emptied the prisons, as he sent ethnic minorities to die. We often forget that Russia, much like China, is essentially an inland empire. That vast swaths of the space you see colored in when you look at a map of Russia by land area, massive country. These are not in any meaningful way historically Russians. These are people who were incorporated into an imperial project in Siberia, on the Pacific coast, in the Caucasus. Most of them are the people who are being sent to fight, as in previous Russian wars, on the front in Ukraine. So in some sense, there's a very dark logic to Putin continuing this conflict. But he does not have infinite resources. I think what's incumbent on NATO is to help the Ukrainians flip two really crucial dynamics of the war. The first is that it's attrition-based. And for the non-military people, that just attrition warfare is kind of the least creative, darkest place wars end up when nobody's got solutions. Think trench warfare in World War I. It's basically who runs out of young men first. That's the war the Ukrainians have been forced into along a long front where they're defensive and they're trying to just not lose their own people more quickly than they can sustain the defense. Those two elements, it's defensive for Ukraine and it's attrition based. We've got to figure out how to flip those two things. There are ways to do that, but it's going to require NATO's willingness to let the Ukrainians do some things we haven't let them do up to this point, and to supply them in a way that we haven't supplied them up to this point. And that, I think, is the challenge. because I am concerned that if we stay in this defensive attrition frame for Ukraine, I mean, how much can one nation take? Um, there's also, I think, there's some things we could do at a more tactical level, Ken. The missile that struck the hospital, a lot of analysts have said this is a KH-101 missile. It's an air-launched cruise missile. Bomber flies up in the sky and launches a subsonic cruise missile, kind of like a Tomahawk, for people who know U.S. weapons, and then flies to the target. Supposedly, it's got a accuracy of 6 to 10 meters. It's really reliant on a lot of electronic components. Despite everything we've done up to this point, a lot of those missiles still have American electronic components in them. So there's a lot more we can do to tighten up the supply chain. These are little things, but the big thing is we've got to flip the logic of the war from defensive and attrition for Ukraine to something that lets the Ukrainians use the creativity they've really displayed up to this point. Incredibly creative tactics by Ukrainians when they're allowed to experiment, change the game, and we've got to get them out of the defense.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Mike, as always, for your analysis. Man, I hope we don't have to have another conversation like this, but knowing Putin's way of war, I bet we will. Appreciate your time.
Sure thing, Ken. Thanks.